So welcome to the first episode of Rivers Radio. We're here in April in the Arundel Arms, and I'm here with Ross Cherrington to talk in detail about farm advice, past, present and future. So first of all, Ross, we're just going to talk a little bit about the past, and then we're going to move forward into the present, and then we'll think a little bit about the future. So starting off, just thinking back many years ago, so how did you come to join the Trust, and what happened?
Well, I suppose my background has always been farming. Grew up on a farm in Hampshire, 9 miles away from the nearest river, but my grandfather luckily had a rod on the test, so we used to go down and watch him fish. He never used to allow us. But then I bought a farm, or I moved to a farm in near Oakhampton in 1997, and everything was going fine, and then foot and mouth, I suppose, was the trigger for joining the Westcountry Rivers Trust. We had foot and mouth on the farm, wiped us out, and I did a lecture tour through New Zealand for the New Zealand government about biosecurity following that, and came back and wondered what on earth I was going to do, and happened to see an advert for the Westcountry Rivers Trust offering fencing grants, and I thought I'd get the advisor out to look around the farm and see what she could offer. Bad timing, my money had run out, but as we were talking I suddenly realised, well, perhaps I could do that. And so I asked whether there was a job going. She said that we just won a new project starting that autumn. Why don't I send my CV in? So that's what I did, and after a little bit of jiggery-pokery with the interviews, that I got myself the first job in 2002 on the Cornwall Rivers project.
Okay, thank you. So going back to that time, what training you had before then, to that point, and then?
Well, I went to agriculture college, which is a traditional way of getting into farming, and that was it really until travelled the world and learnt various things. So University of Life. But when I joined the Trust, we had a 2-week induction course. For those who were starting, it was a combination of agriculture and fisheries management, run by the Trust. Very worthwhile. We do something similar now for all advisors, not over 2 weeks, but over the course of about 5 days. Certainly for the fisheries bit, it was very important for me to do that.
And then, sort of moving through, starting. Obviously, you started off, with that brief training. Since then, what sort of training has developed, and particularly sort of thinking about training that will be applicable to all sorts of people working in farm advice.
We did when we started training, we were going out there and we had a sort of an ad hoc idea of what we should be talking about when it came to fertilisers and manures. That seemed to be the main problems. But then we put the whole Trust through the FACTS course, the Fertiliser Advisor Certificate training. That has been without doubt the best thing that I've ever done. It was very difficult to pass, not everybody passed it. And since then I've done the business training SFEDI, S-F-E-D-I. I've also done the Basis Soil and Water course, and I've had numerous training sessions through the cross compliance and training advice service that I do. Apart from the sort of in-depth agronomy training, which I could do if I thought about it, I've had pretty much everything that's going on at that time now. And you learn everything. Just going to a farm is training in its own right.
So do you actually find that training, it's formally useful to let the farmer know you have that training, or is it just because it informs you and therefore you find you do the job better?
A bit of both, really. Certainly the FACTS training is almost essential for everything I do myself. Every job needs to have that qualification behind it. But that will allow you to give professional advice to farmers, and once they know that you're FACTS qualified, then they know that's just a step up above the general guy coming out trying to sell you fertiliser because he's got a boatload coming from Plymouth.
Yeah.
So it gives you some kudos when you're telling him to reduce his phosphate levels in his fertiliser because of this. He then believes that you're actually saying what is right rather than what you want as a Rivers Trust.
Yeah.
And that that not to preach is actually quite important.
Okay, so we've been through the training and how you started, and I think you briefly alluded there to the Cornwall Rivers project. To me, that was that a bit of a pivotal movement, really, and a moment for the movement of improving rivers. That really to a large extent led on to CSF and what we see now from modern catchment sensitive farming. So do you think you could give us a sort of a little bit of view about how that process actually worked? I mean, how did it lead on to such a big thing as CSF is now?
The Cornwall Rivers project just grew into the all-encompassing, overarching way of environmental groups talking to farmers. There had been an isolation between the farming community and environmentalists. A lot of preaching had been going on a lot of things, and this was a way of showing that actually the two groups could work together for the common good. None of the advice we gave to the farmers was anything other than financial. Although we tied it to an environmental bent, we talked finance, and that's the farm's a business, and so you can't go along and say do this because it's better for a bird or it's better for a fish if it's going to bankrupt the farm or if it's going to cost the farm money. That doesn't work. They won't do it unless they're particularly interested in it. And 90% of farms like to see the countryside. They don't deliberately go out to try and kill a river off, but if it impinges on their income, then they won't do it.
Yeah.
So it was a way. It showed that what we were saying was right. It was benchmarked and tested against everything that was going to work. For the common good. It was written up in a number of papers, and it got picked up by Natural England, DEFRA as it started, as a way of them getting their message over for their environmental credentials over to farmers as well. So CSF came along to us and studied what we did when it started. The senior civil servant came down who was involved, and we were heavily involved in training the original catchment sensitive farming officers from the word go, and we continue to train them now. So they always say imitation is the greatest form of flattery.
Yep.
And all we can say is that, all I can say is that I feel that CSF grew out of Cornwall Rivers Project and the work that the Westcountry Rivers Trust did, to a point where it's now, seen as something that is, on the level with everybody. Everybody understands that it works.
Yeah.
There are frustrations, sometimes you lose your work and good members of staff to catchment sensitive farming because they've come into your area, and sometimes it works the other way around. We seem to have attracted quite a few CSFOs in to work for the trust now.
So it seems that principle though that the Cornwall Rivers Project established, then you can see that just has rippled out and changed the way everyone sees farming.
Yes, and I think it's
from a
conservation point. I think it showed that you cannot insist that farmers do it. So you've got to show a really good financial reason why they should do it. And all the stewardship programs are the same. And we're not blowing TRP as the main thing. There's been everything from the Game Conservancy's Allerton project, which has been going for about the same period of time, looking at birds and bees and butterflies, and the Cornwall Rivers project was more of a rivery type thing.
Sure.
It was seen as quite an aggressive stepping on the toes of the Environment Agency for a bit, and we had a very difficult relationship with the Environment Agency when Cornwall Rivers project started. They felt that we were taking their job away from them.
Yeah.
That was definitely one of the challenges. But after a while, they realised that we were able to get onto the farms better than they were. Farmers were more likely to tell us what they were and show us where there were problems, because they knew we possibly could help them with some grants, or we could help them with where they could find some grants or some advice to do it. Whereas the Environment Agency was the last thing that the farmers wanted to see turning up on their doorstep.
Yeah, so it's really that lack of any statutory power which actually increased effectiveness.
The fact that we were utterly
side.
Confidential.
Yeah.
Once we'd got onto a farm and organised a way to get on the farm, we never ever reported back to the powers that be what we saw.
Yeah.
We didn't go in and gossip, I'd been to Mr. Smith down the road and gosh, he's a shocker, or all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Unless you were invited to talk about his uncle that had a problem, you didn't mention where you'd been.
Yeah.
They all knew where you'd been because the farming gossip comes around, and once you got onto a farm in an area, you'd start getting phone calls from other farmers saying, I've heard you've been to my neighbour and that sort of thing. So it was that trust which took a while to build up. The trust is all important. If they feel that you're not trustworthy and likely to drop them in it, then they will stop you from coming in right from the word go.
Yeah.
And that was the thing.
Okay, so thank you, Ross. So we're moving on now to the present. So really, what the problem's now. So what would you say right now are the main threats to water quality as it goes eventually into rivers?
The main threats to water quality is the fact that farmers aren't making any money. And so they will start cutting corners and trying to grow crops in the wrong place, or try to concentrate cattle and do cattle cheaper. So cheaper high phosphate foods, for instance, or just trying to keep lots of animals outdoors in the wrong places. Using more single pass, more toxic pesticides rather than multiple pass, less toxic pesticides, cutting down on maintenance of their machinery so that the accuracy doesn't get there. Those are the main threats now. I think the fact that they are just desperate to try and keep their noses above water. The dairy industry is on its knees in the West Country at the moment. And with that, you're not getting investments in farm buildings, you're not getting investments in better cattle, you're not getting investments in farm infrastructure, fences are falling apart, different crops are grown in the wrong areas, and those are the main worries, and just the wrong crops in the wrong place.
Okay, so you turn up to a farm, you've never been there before, you need to get across the farmer's doorway. How do you do it?
This is something I really enjoy doing, but we always do it by generally cold calling, which is hard work. And you do it with mentioning that you are who you are from, who you're not from, that it's confidential, that there are offers of grant funding or signposting to grant funding that's there. It's entirely up to them whether they have you on the farm or not. And you've got to get that confidentiality, saving money. Best for the environment in those orders. Don't go environment first and money last. Go confidentiality, money, environment. And farmers, it can be a lonely business sometimes. They might not see anybody for months and months and months, other than perhaps reps that are trying to sell them something they can't afford, or the RPA coming to do an inspection or whatever. And so actually they're quite proud of showing you around. And if you can offer that sort of trust that you're confidential, that there might be certain ways that they can save you money, then they'll normally let you on. Might not be then. Might be, might have to organise it for a week later or 2 weeks later, and then you'll go on and they'll sit down in the farm kitchen and discuss what the farm business is. As long as they know you're trustworthy, you're not involved particularly with the Rural Payments Agency and the Environment Agency, you're likely to get on.
So that leads me on. It sounds to me like you're saying that basically having a grant isn't the essential tool you need to get on a farm then?
It certainly helps.
Okay.
It certainly helps. It's not the essential tool if you can persuade the farmer that what the advice they're going to give is going to save them money.
Yeah.
But having a grant certainly helps. And it is, some grants work and some grants don't. But having that little bit of cash behind that as a sweetener can help. There's quite a lot of time being asked of farmers from a lot of groups. Come along to meetings, come along to discussion groups, come along to whatever, where the sort of NGOs and the Environment Agency and DEFRA, all their staff are being paid to be there, and the farmers aren't. And so if you can offer them something as a service that is financial to them, then they're much more likely to take these things. It doesn't necessarily have to be a grant.
Okay.
It has to be a money saving.
But you need to come onto the farm with some kind of offer of some kind then.
I think so. You can't come onto the farm just as an environmentalist.
Yeah.
Doesn't work. Unless they're particularly interested. But we have targets, same as everybody else.
So then you're already preaching to the converted, aren't you? If
yes, you are. But even if you're preaching to converted, you can, A, you'll always learn something by talking to them, but B, you can nearly always find something that you can just say, well, have you thought about doing it this way? Well, this might save you 10% on your fuel bill by doing it this way, or it might save you, 10% on your water bill, or, it may save you some electricity, that sort of thing. And it's just, and they'll say, prove it, in which case you write your farm plan, and you do all the figures based on your best knowledge. It's always useful to have something in your head that you can do a rough ballpark figure and say, well, this is what I think it should work out at.
Yeah.
And as long as you don't they believe you, you'll get on.
Okay. So you're on the farm. You've established a rapport with the farmer. They trust you. Or at least they're prepared to start to trust you. Begin that process. What do you actually look for when you get on that farm?
It's a 360 degree look at the farm to start off with. I suppose the first thing I look for is the farmer himself.
Yeah.
What his demeanour is, what his age is, how he carries himself. You can see a lot of slump-shouldered older farmers who can't see a way out, I think, in some cases, or can't see a way of getting it better. And then we'd like to go out onto the farm, and you'll look at the state of the buildings, and you'll look at the state of the machinery, and you'll look at the state of the animals, and you'll look up and look down and look everywhere. And that initial aspect, gutters missing, or frayed tin, or tractors falling apart, or animals limping, give you a set impression of, or it might be perfect, brand new, clean machinery, barns in good condition, fantastically well bedded down cattle, all that sort of thing. And it'll give you an idea of what the pressures are going on that farm. And if you get that as the first sort of 5 minutes, then you can make an initial judgment. And you make a judgment, but you never tell them. So and then you listen and you don't judge, because there's always pressures of why the farm is in that sort of situation.
Yep.
And then you need to be sneaky. And then you need to start looking around the back of sheds and around the back of slurry pits and inside sheds, and you do it politely. Do you mind if we walk around here? Do you mind if we go down and look at this? Do you mind if we, always ask their permission first, particularly ask their permission before taking photographs.
Yeah.
If you take photographs of a dead cow in a river, they'll get very cross, or a leaking slurry pit without their permission. They'll, even if you told them it's all confidential, get their permission first. And the first 5 minutes, you can get an impression of what the farm is very quickly, and whether it's going to be a long-term relationship, or whether it's going to be on and off very quickly.
Okay, so when I think back to Cornwall Rivers Project and other older projects, I often think about win-win farm advice as being the cornerstone. But now we've moved on from that. So what is win-win advice, and then why have we needed to do more?
What is win-win advice? Win-win advice is where you work out a savings, and a simple way would be work out how much rainwater is falling in a slurry pit. It costs a certain amount of money to spread liquid out of slurry pit, whether it's from a pump or whether it's from a tanker. And if you can stop the rainwater going in, it saves the farmers money. It also means you won't have to spread it during the winter when it's going to run off, or spread it at too great a rate where it's going to run off and not be used. And so that's the win-win. So you win by protecting the watercourses, so the slurry is going onto the fields when it is best being used, and the farmer wins because he can optimise nutrients in his slurry, so he doesn't have to use quite so much fertiliser. So it's a financial saving for him. It's an environmental benefit for us. That's a typical win-win situation. We've moved on mainly because I think everybody's caught up. The win-win situations are less win-win. The dramatic savings we found in the Cornwall Rivers project have almost gone, because most farms, because the Cornwall Rivers project has been rolled out nationwide, particularly in the southwest, most farmers have caught up with that. All the farming press has caught up with that, about how to save money and win-wins, and it was developed not only by Westcountry Rivers Trust, but by other groups out there as well.
Yeah.
And so now you're having to be a little bit more constructive, maybe. So you are looking at things such as the payment for ecosystem services, and whether that is stewardship agreements, or whether that is payments from water companies to try and reduce their costs, or whether it's payment from dredging companies having to dredge the river, all fishing groups, all that sort of thing. There are different things at work where farmers can access funds, and those funds, it's a little still win-win, because there are still winners, and both parties still win, but the parties have changed. Okay. That's my view anyway. So we still look at slurry storage, and we still look at that sort of thing, but there are other ways of. So
would it be fair to say that the win-wins are the foundation? They still exist.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be able to build the payments for ecosystem services without it, but then you can go beyond the win-wins.
You can then go beyond that. the idea that farmers can be paid on top of anything else is out there for certain benefits that they provide society is a relatively new concept. It's now seems to be the buzzword with everybody you talk to. And every single organisation seems to have a PAS department within it.
Yes.
Some of them don't quite understand what it's all about, and some of them don't believe it works. But it is there, and whilst it's there, that is the next stage of going on. And my personal opinion is as long as it pays the farmer enough money, he'll do it.
Okay. So far we've talked about very positive things. Let's think negatively now. How do you get thrown off a farm in the quickest possible amount of time?
The quickest possible amount of time is you start criticising what they're doing.
Yep.
That is the quickest one. The next thing is to say that you're here on behalf of Rural Payments Agency or the Environment Agency.
Yep.
That's almost guaranteed to get you thrown off, unless you're there on behalf of the Environment Agency to stop them being prosecuted. That's a different thing.
Yeah.
But really criticising what they're doing,
Yep.
being very negative of how they're managing their farm,
Yep.
only finding bad things and not finding any good things to say
Yep.
about it is the things. And there are some grumpy people out there, and being aggressive to them is always the way of getting in. I'm right, you're wrong is
Yep.
the best way of getting thrown off.
When you're on the farm, and obviously there's a huge range of different things you could say to a farmer, and you've said you don't want to be critical, so you've got to limit what you recommend, because getting into petty details is not going to get you anywhere. So, in general, what are the 5 most important things that you can talk about that will improve, on water quality and quantity coming off of a farm?
Okay. Number 1 is manure and slurry storage.
Yeah.
If all farmers, certainly in the West Country where we have an awful lot of rain, had 5 months storage for their slurry and their manure, that would be the number 1 protection of watercourses, because they just wouldn't need to go onto the fields and spread it when the fields are wet, which damages soil structure, which leads to nutrient losses, etc., etc. So that is my number 1 priority. The second one is that everybody needs to soil test. It's financially the best thing that any farmer can do. You've got to know what to put onto your crops, and the only way you're going to do that is to soil test, and most do, but there's still a significant number don't. Then they've got to look for compaction. Got to get out and dig some holes, see what the state of their land is. If your soils are compacted, your crops aren't going to grow, and they're not going to take the nutrients up that you apply, so you're wasting money there. Then they ought to get all their machinery calibrated. So their fertiliser spreaders and their dung spreaders and their sprayers all ought to be calibrated. And if they can get those calibrated, then they put it on accurately. And it's pointless overlapping, and it's pointless going too close to a hedge or too close to a watercourse, that sort of thing. Besides which you'll get penalised by the RPA. So that's 4. And the next one is take advantage of what is a large amount of advice that's out there. There's a lot of free advice out there. Catchment Sensitive Farming do workshops. The Farm Advisory Service do workshops. We do workshops under the Upstream Thinking Project. So there's lots and lots of free advice out there, which is all designed to save them money.
So all those things, it strikes me there's a pattern there. All those things are about enabling a farmer to control the farm environment and get it accurately right.
Yeah. I mean, a case in point is if you've got 2 months storage for your slurry, you're forever trying to wait for that window of opportunity to get it out onto the fields.
Yeah.
November, December time, which may be a very narrow period of time where you can get out your fields. But you may have something else important. You may be calving, or you may have a sale, you may be TB testing, all those sort of things.
Yeah.
All of which impinge on your time to do it. And the thing that farmers seem to have lost over the last 10, 15 years is the ability to manage their time. They always seem to be chasing their tails to try and get things done. And even if they're using contractors, they could be last on the list, so the timing gets wrong, or they could be first on the list, so it's a little bit too soon. So that essence of timeliness is what will make their farming life better, and that's what those sort of things all do. It gives a sense of being able to control their work-life balance a bit better. Yeah. Not having to charge off at any time and work all night.
Control their work balance.
Control their work balance. Yeah. And if you control your work balance, you'll control your work finance balance.
Yeah.
And that makes a huge difference. 5 months storage is expensive. It's expensive to put in.
Yeah.
And there are lots of rules and regulations which mean it has to be built in a certain way or in a certain place and has to be inspected and all that sort of business. And if you can, and none of the grants, other than the recent upstream thinking ones, would actually do anything to help, generally help slurry storage. They tinker around the edges, but they wouldn't actually say, here's 5 months storage, there we go.
So at the moment we see most of the drops of rain that fall in the West Country, they fall on farmland, therefore we see farmers as the major impactors on water quality. How do the farmers see water? How do they perceive water themselves on their farm as a resource? What do they think about it? Do they spend much time thinking about it?
Not really. No, not really, unless they are particularly interested in the environment or fishing or kayaking or whatever. Generally, they see it as something that to be exploited. In some cases, they allow the cattle to drink from watercourses. They're still allowed to, or they have their own borehole, lots of boreholes going in, or they see it as an impingement on what they can do on their farm. So actually, watercourses generally they're not particularly positive managers of them. That doesn't mean they don't positively mismanage them. They don't. They don't generally go out there to think of anything other than.
So really, you're saying it's an incidental factor that sometimes
not worth
comes into
any
play.
Money to them.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not worth unless they are unless perhaps a holiday cottage and people like to walk by the rivers. Water's a fantastic thing to walk by. Unless they are selling the view under a marketing ploy, or they're selling their allowing their cattle to water from the rivers because it's the cheapest way of doing it. Generally, the water is incidental to their farm business.
Okay, so coming back to an earlier point, you mentioned the importance of getting permission for any photos that you take. Why do you want to take photos? How do those photos end up improving management on a farm? I think
it is a classic. A photo is worth 1,000 words, and you want to make those plans as succinct as possible. So a photo, otherwise if you make it reams and reams of Tolstoy War and Peace type level, nobody's going to read it.
Yeah.
And so a photo just showing a leak out of the back of the slurry pit, or a scorch mark down across the field, or soil being washed into the streams, that just encapsulates everything that you've tried to tell them in one simple method of doing it. And
do you think that as well, that avoids you from having to criticise, because you just say this is what it is and this is
no, I think the criticise is criticise, yes, but you do it you've got to do it quite gently. So if they've lost half their field with soil runoff, you just explain how much extra it costs to get it back into good condition, or what they're losing in seed, or what they're losing in fertiliser that they've applied. And the photograph will just reinforce what you happened, and they'll remember what you said on the visit without perhaps even having to read the report.
Yes.
And so they'll flick through it, and there'll be this photograph of whatever, and they'll say, "Oh yes, I remember that. Whoever came out, that's what he said about it. I ought to think about doing something. I wonder whether I can get some help." And there'll be a list of people who can help, and it makes a huge difference.
So you've briefly touched there on the farm plan. So how important the tool is that?
Oh, I think it's essential. I think that an individually tailored, with little or no cut and paste, written specifically for that farmer, with his name, he can make it personal, is absolutely essential. And it's got to be simple, succinct, and get everything that you discussed over on the farm.
And cut and paste, I mean, that's always the temptation in the model world, isn't it? Trying to increase efficiencies by sort of mass and bulk producing reports.
Yeah.
So that, you say that can be seen through in an instant.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. There's lots of people doing farm plans.
Yeah.
Even just in the southwest, you have catchment sensitive farming doing farm plans, and not only do they just do farm plans, they do a range of farm plans, all based on the same template generally.
Yep.
So they'll have a farm infrastructure farm plan, and they'll have a water management farm plan, and a whole farm plan, and a pesticide plan, and a nutrient plan. So they could have 5 plans just for catchment sensitive farming. I think if you have one particular advisor, you can go out there and do all 4, and pick the 3 or 4 main bits of the whole farm. That'll make a huge difference. And the farm plan and the farm visit is to move farmers, in our view, or in my view, just one step up each time.
Yep.
So if he's got a problem with his manure management, you can move him up one step, and then you can start concentrating on water management and that sort of thing. And that involves a long-term relationship. I've been working in the Tamar now for 12 years.
Yeah.
And I know I've had farmers there that I've known for 12 years, and I've been back 10 times, and almost know them first name terms and all sorts of business. So
Yeah.
that period of personality and getting a long-term relationship with farmers makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
ADAS used to have it when they were the DEFRA or MAF advisory board. ADAS had that. They had an advisor who was there for decades, and everybody knew him, and they knew they could phone him up and ask him a question, and he would, if he didn't know, he'd find somebody who would. And that's gone. It was a great success during the farm revolution, and it's gone now. And now it's been replaced by a myriad of NGOs and various interest groups that are all out there with little bits and pots of money with very short-term things. So that continuation of advice over a long period of time and who to get hold of is absolutely essential.
Yeah, so that's the trick, because these problems, they didn't occur overnight, and they're not going to be fixed overnight as well.
No. And a lot of the projects are very short term, 3, 4, 5 years. You never see a long term project, and having to access funds is very difficult. And catchment sensitive farming have found it very difficult to have a continuous funding source, and haven't known within 2 weeks of the next round starting that are even going. So you have a vast turnover of catchment sensitive farming officers. Tamar, for instance, has had 5, I think, over the 8 years it's been going. So they've all had to build up their relationship with farmers, and all had to, prove themselves to the farmers that they're there for a very short period of time until they either leave or they moved off somewhere else.
Okay, thank you. So I think that draws to a close the present situation. So for the next section, we'll move on thinking about the future and what does that hold.
I am a bit pessimistic about farming in the southwest. I have to say, I don't mean to be. There's a lot of small farms in the southwest, and the margins that they can make are quite small. They suffer because it rains a lot, and they suffer because there's a lack of market, so it costs a bit more to farm. And they suffer a little bit because they're very individual. The cooperation between farmers is quite difficult to get round. So they're all competing against each other. They're all having to work on small farms with limited scale of costings, and they are completely at risk to factors outside their control. So political movements, we've got the European ban on or restrictions on Russia, for instance, which is affecting the milk price, and it's affecting price of beef that can be exported. And then you have different harvests. So they've had a particularly good harvest in Australia and America over the last 2 years. So the price of wheat has halved in a year. So there's so many factors that are out of their control. I think the dairy industry will continue to compress. I think the cattle herds will get bigger, which will increase the problems. I think the beef is under pressure because of tuberculosis, TB in the things. There's, if you're struck down with TB, you can't sell anything, or if you do sell it, it's not getting its actual value. Sheep is affected by world prices dramatically. Cereals we've already talked about. And so I think the farmers have to be a little bit more out of the box type thinking if they're going to rely on pure agriculture to survive. I think they need to look at marketing better. I think they need to look at training better. I think they need to look at benchmarking their particular businesses so they're knowing what they should be spending. I think they should be. I think they need to look at diversification, whether that is in tourism, whether that is in energy, whether that is in letting out their farm buildings. They've all got to look at that. But we're a long way away from a market down here. We'll have a massive summer influx of tourists, and then nothing in the winter. And so there is very much a seasonality there, which they have to worry about. So the ability to weather financial storms is less than it used to be, and those financial storms seem to be becoming greater.
So that's the the picture of the problems that are facing farmers into the future, how does that then reflect on farm advisors? How are they going to respond to those new and or more acute existing problems?
Well, I think they have to be a lot smarter. Mm-hmm. They can't just go and talk about birds and bees anymore, because they've got to be able. They have to keep up with all the new trends and know their costings and know their things. So the farm advisors need continual training and to keep update with these things. They need to be very focused on what they're actually offering and what they're trying to achieve, and not be drawn away into something that's a bit off the radar for what's going on.
Focus back on the farm economy, basically.
Very much so.
Yep.
Very much so. And the economy is still going to be the big driver. Farming will survive. I mean, it will survive, but whether it will survive in the way that we've been used to in the southwest is a different thing. So you could see tenant farmers, just upping sticks and leaving the farm.
Yeah.
And actually, in some ways, if it's an older farm and they can leave that farm with some sense of dignity, that's not a bad idea, because it'll bring in the younger, perhaps more finance and environmentally focused farmers into the region. So they will know what they're going to do. They will have a proper business plan of how they're going to manage the rent and the upkeep and the livestock and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Because the average age of farmers in the southwest is 57, and it's increasing a year every year. I'm nearly there myself.
I guess that can't go on forever, can it?
It cannot go on forever. And the price of land is very expensive.
Yes, it's been going up and up recently,
and that's going up. And the ability for a young farmer to either take on the farm and let his parents retire, or to buy a farm or get a tenancy, is very restricted.
Yeah.
Farm rents, for whatever reason, are much higher than they ought to be, because they're based on land prices as much as anything.
Yeah.
So you can't get into agriculture without having a particular nest egg behind you, or a support from your family to get in there and do it. And so there needs to be ways to encourage a younger, more focused, more energetic farming community within the southwest.
Oh, I think that's a great way to end this conversation, because it is going to be that next generation of young farmer that will be interacting with, that will make that difference to their farms and to the water environment that we're concerned about. So thanks very much, then, Ross.
You're welcome.
Cheers.